This isn't the story you're usually told about girlhood in the 1950s. The story you're usually told is tidy. It smells faintly of hairspray and milkshakes. It has saddle shoes and Letterman jackets and gymnasium lights strung up for the spring fling. Has wholesome boys and sweet girls and a universe where everyone knows the rules. It's a story about innocence. That's the version that makes it into nostalgia specials. That's the version that gets turned into musicals. But nostalgia is selective memory. There's another story about girlhood in the post-war decades in the United States and the United Kingdom. It's quieter, it's less photogenic, it doesn't get choreography. It starts small. A girl's clothes fit differently. She stops swimming in the summer. She says she's tired. Adults watch her a little too closely. Teachers glance at her a little longer. A neighbor asks a question that sounds casual but isn't. No one says the word. That's part of the script. The silence is polite. It's careful. It's heavy. Her friends begin recalculating. Some drift away because proximity suddenly feels risky. Some lean closer because they want to hear all of the rumors. Boys remember jokes she made months ago and decide those jokes are evidence. And then, one week, she's gone. She's helping an aunt. She's visiting a sick relative. She's taking time away. The explanation is vague because it needs to be. Vagueness gives everyone cover. Vagueness protects the school, the church, the family, the neighbors. This wasn't rare. It happened often enough to generate a script. Often enough that everyone understood their lines. Often enough that communities knew how to rearrange themselves around the absence without ever acknowledging what caused it. When something happens so often that people know exactly what to say, exactly how to explain it, exactly which relatives to invoke and how long the absence should last, it stops being an isolated moral failure. It becomes part of the routine of society. If entire communities can coordinate the same polite fiction without needing instructions, then the pattern isn't rare, it's familiar, it's anticipated. And when disappearance has a script, when silence has choreography, when everyone knows their role without rehearsal, that isn't just culture expressing a value. That's a system running on a schedule. Chivalry needed men. Domesticity needed walls. Marriage needed contracts. Reputation just needs witnesses. Welcome back to Bitchy History. I'm Professor Meredith, and this is Good Girls Don't, The Cage of Reputation.
Something that's, kind of bitchy.
Pretty bitchy.
Bitchy? I know.
It's just, bitchy.
Well, first of all, you're a little bitchy. That's next level bitchy.
The good girl is not a personality. She's a classification for society. In the post-war period especially, the good girl functioned as social currency. Her worth reassured institutions. Her restraint signaled stability. Her purity stood in for family honor. Her body became the surface on which community values were displayed. And reputation is enforcement with better branding. It doesn't require police. It requires anticipation. It requires a girl to internalize the knowledge that being seen the wrong way could cost her everything. Schooling, employment, marriage prospects, family support, even safety. And it's held together by the lie of choice. She chose this. She knew better. She should have protected herself. If something happens to her, it becomes evidence of her failure to manage risk properly. That's not morality, that's social governance. And in the post-war decades, both in the United States and the United Kingdom, that governance was mass-produced. If you want to see how a society teaches this system, you look at its entertainment. Because pop culture doesn't just reflect rules, it rehearses them. So let's start by talking about your mom's favorite musical. Grease is set in 1959, but it was produced in 1978. It is nostalgia layered over nostalgia. It packages the 1950s as a mischievous but safe, rebellious but ultimately conservative period. And inside that candy coating is a remarkably efficient moral instruction manual. Sandy is introduced as the good girl. She's framed as sweet, modest, restrained. Her innocence is treated as valuable but fragile. She's desirable precisely because she appears untouched. Rizzo is framed as her opposite. She's sexually experienced, sarcastic, sharp. She does not perform innocence. She does not apologize for desire. The film positions them as opposites, but what it actually shows is two different punishments. Sandy is mocked for being too pure. She's naive, out of place, uncool. Rizzo is punished for being too sexual. She's labeled, humiliated, socially precarious. Neither option is safe. And then the plot sharpens the lesson with pregnancy. Rizzo's pregnancy scare is not played for comedy. For a few scenes, the music drops away and the social stakes become all too visible. Her fear is not just of motherhood, it's of losing her reputation. Pregnancy makes sex undeniable. It turns rumor into evidence. It converts private behavior into public identity. And in a reputation economy, evidence is the problem. The rumor spreads quickly. Other girls whisper, the boys distance themselves. Her body becomes communal property. She becomes a cautionary tale in real time. But notice what doesn't happen. The boys involved don't face equal reputational collapse. Their sexuality is allowed. Hers is a defining trait, and not a good one. When the test comes back negative, the social system stabilizes, the threat vanishes, the group dynamic resets. The crisis dissolves because the evidence dissolves. Then we get Sandy's transformation. It's framed as empowerment, as choice, as confidence. But what it actually dramatizes is adaptation under pressure. Sandy learns how to perform desirability in a way that satisfies male expectation without overtly threatening the moral order. She recalibrates herself to remain visible and lovable within the system. The film ends with applause. But here's the thing. Grease gets a reset button. Rizzo gets a reset button. Real girls didn't. Real girls didn't get a song. They didn't get a makeover montage. They didn't get the option to re-enter the group with applause. They got institutions, and those institutions followed a pattern. First, you disappear the girl. Then, you process the baby. Then, you manage the fallout. That pattern shows up in different forms in both the United States and the United Kingdom during this period. Different bureaucracies, different legal systems, same logic. And that's where we're going next. Door number 1, disappear the girl. Those of us who went to high school in the 1950s and 60s remember them well. The girls who would be at school one day and then gone the next, mysteriously absent for the rest of the school year. A Detroit News columnist remembered the girls in her all-girl Catholic school who would be there one morning and gone the next, mysteriously absent. When one friend vanished mid-senior year, they were told she'd gone to Europe for a trip. Some even received postcards with cheery notes postmarked from Paris. Years later, they learned the truth. She had been a few miles away in a home for unwed mothers. That choreography was not rare. In fact, it was common enough to have props. Between 1945 and 1973, more than 1.5 million young women in the United States surrendered babies for adoption. Historians call it the baby scoop era. Ann Fessler, who interviewed more than 100 of these women for her documentary The Girls Who Went Away, documents the ritual. Pregnancy discovered, shame declared, removal arranged. Some girls were pulled from school immediately. High schools and colleges often required pregnant students to be withdrawn. Families sometimes drew the curtains and instructed daughters to duck down in the back seat of the car so neighbors wouldn't see their changing bodies. A young unmarried college student interviewed decades later described returning to campus after relinquishing her baby and realizing simply, I wasn't happy anymore. I realized there was something really wrong. The removal was geographic, but it was also psychological. In Ireland and Britain, the pattern was different in structure but similar in intent. As Claire Wills writes of the Irish network of mother and baby homes, these institutions weren't so much secret as in the business of secrecy. They were often large, visible buildings, former workhouses or repurposed estates, funded by local authorities and run by religious orders. Everyone knew they existed. Their purpose was to render illegitimacy invisible. Between 1922 and 1998, at least 56,000 unmarried mothers passed through Irish mother and baby homes, along with at least 57,000 children. The proportion of unmarried mothers admitted in 20th century Ireland was likely the highest in Europe. Women stayed longer than in comparable institutions elsewhere, often more than a year in the 1940s and 1950s. Disappear the girl, preserve the village. It was organized. Across the Atlantic in the United States, many girls were sent to maternity homes run by organizations like the Florence Crittenton Association, Catholic Charities, and the Salvation Army. The homes were described as a refuge. Residents often called them something else. One woman remembered arriving and feeling as though she had committed a crime. Another described the daily structure: assigned chores, supervised letters, limited contact with family. Some used pseudonyms in the home. Some were discouraged from going outside. Expenses were often covered, but only if the mother agreed to surrender her baby. The message was consistent. You're too young. Your baby deserves better. You deserve a second chance. Adoption was presented as noble. Keeping the baby was framed as selfish. One woman later summarized the atmosphere bluntly. It's punitive. That's it in a nutshell. You don't deserve the baby. The physical experience of birth compounded the emotional coercion. Several accounts describe pre-Lamaze labor in which girls were drugged, shaven, given enemas, and instructed to comply. One girl who hoped to keep her baby reported being tied to her hospital bed because staff feared she would run away with her newborn. Another was denied pain medication until she signed adoption papers. I never felt like I gave my baby away, one woman told Fessler. I always felt like my daughter was taken from me. Irish mother and baby homes were funded by local taxes, staffed by religious orders, and serviced by county councils. They were inexpensive for the state and efficient for families who wished to avoid scandal. The consequences were catastrophic. At Bessborough in Cork, more than 900 children died. Over a 20-year period in the mid-20th century, roughly 25% of babies born there did not survive, 5 times the national infant mortality rate. A common cause of death recorded in the home's own registers was marasmus, malnutrition. Burial records exist for only 64 of the 900 children. In 2014, historian Catherine Corliss uncovered evidence that nearly 800 infants and small children had been interred in a disused septic tank at the former Bon Secours home in Tuam. The discovery forced the Irish government to establish a commission of investigation. The commission's own report later stated that, in the years before 1960, mother and baby homes did not save the lives of illegitimate children. In fact, they appear to have significantly reduced their prospects of survival. These homes were not a refuge for mother or baby, they were a social quarantine. And once the girl was removed from sight, the next question was what you did with the baby, if it even survived. In the United States, adoption was presented as a gift. The rhetoric was careful. Married adoptive couples were framed as stable, deserving, morally upright. Young unmarried mothers, on the other hand, were told they were offering their children opportunity because they were clearly too irresponsible to care for them. One of these unwed mothers, when interviewed years later, said that for 21 years, every single night, 365 days a year, she would look up at the stars and think, "We're under the same sky," because it was the only way she could feel close to the son she'd been forced to surrender. Another explained how the loss reshaped her identity. The part of me that was his mother remained 17, and the rest of me continued to grow. Many were told never to speak of it again. Silence was presented as healing. One woman developed a speech disorder while in the maternity home. Years later, a specialist asked when it began. "At the home for unwed mothers," she answered. The therapist replied, "Do you think you're the only person who gave a baby up for adoption? Why are you taking it so hard?" Another psychiatrist suggested she pretend the baby had been born dead. It would make it easier. The language of minimization was relentless. Christine, one of Fessler's interviewees, later reflected on the stark contrast between giving birth as an unmarried teenager and giving birth as a married woman. "I was the same person, but all because of Mrs., they treated me like a human being." Legitimacy transformed the body. In Britain, approximately 185,000 children were adopted from unmarried mothers between 1949 and 1976. The Joint Committee on Human Rights later concluded that many women did not give fully informed consent to adoption. Testimony collected during the inquiry describes young women being told repeatedly that surrender was for the best. That phrase echoes across accounts. For the best, for the baby, for your future. It was not only families making these decisions. Social workers, medical staff, voluntary agencies, and local authorities constructed the pathway. As one analysis put it, institutions did not necessarily issue direct orders, but they built systems that made certain outcomes feel inevitable. This wasn't just a family decision, it was a bureaucratic solution to embarrassment. And when the paperwork was complete, the file closed, and the girl returned. However, return didn't always mean restoration. Back at school, classmates were told stories: illness, visiting relatives, studying abroad, etc. The girls re-entered hallways where everyone understood what had happened, but no one said it out loud. They felt they could erase it, one woman reflected, but we aren't made that way. It's unnatural to be separated from your child that way. Many women described afterlives marked by depression, numbness, rage, or overachievement. Some turned to substance abuse. Some pursued helping professions. Some developed chronic migraines that flared each year around the anniversary of surrender. "I suffered this alone for 21 years so everyone around me would be comfortable," one woman said. "Don't talk about it because it makes us uncomfortable." And I didn't. Claire Wills writes that a whole society learned not to look too closely. Daughters disappeared into institutions, babies disappeared with new families, families reshaped themselves around the missing. The past was not forgotten so much as disremembered. The system didn't just remove the baby, it removed the evidence. And when the institution stepped back, the hallway took over. When you look at the historical record, you can find the euphemisms in plain sight. Charity advertisements offering help for girls in trouble, advice columns describing pregnancy as moral failure, school records that quietly list transferred when everyone knew the word meant sent away. In some schools, administrators warned students not to associate with pregnant classmates. Girls returned briefly to collect belongings under the weight of the stares of their peers. Reputation was monitored in cafeterias and church pews. Other girls learned quickly. Distance yourself. Association carried risk. The message was clear without being written. Visibility invited punishment. Silence preserved your standing. Punishment only works if someone watches. The hallway empties. The file closes. The story continues in whispers. But now we've seen the infrastructure. But infrastructure doesn't fall evenly. The good girl was never a universal category. It was selective. It was racialized. It was classed. And in many cases, it was inaccessible from the start. In the United States, Ann Fessler makes a pointed observation in The Girls Who Went Away. Fewer African American families disowned their daughters or insisted that they surrender their children. That line disrupts the dominant narrative immediately. The baby scoop era adoption surge was disproportionately concentrated among white middle-class families. Why? Because the ideal being protected was specifically white and middle class. Post-war American respectability was built around the suburban nuclear family, Ozzie and Harriet, not sharecroppers or domestic workers. Illegitimacy threatened a particular social image. The panic was not abstract morality, it was the collapse of a curated middle-class performance. That doesn't mean black women were spared stigma. They were not, but the stigma operated differently. Historical racial stereotypes in the United States have long denied black girls the presumption of innocence. Contemporary research on adultification bias shows that black girls are perceived as older, less innocent, and more knowledgeable about sex than their white peers. Studies indicate that adults are more likely to view black girls as needing less protection and less nurturing. If innocence is the currency of the good girl, and some girls are never granted innocence in the first place, then the cage just operates differently for them. White middle-class daughters were hidden to preserve purity myths. Black girls were often denied those myths altogether. The double standard is brutal. One group is punished for falling from innocence, the other is rarely allowed to inhabit innocence at all from childhood. And class mattered just as much. Respectability was a luxury product. Some families could afford it, others got priced out. Middle-class families had the resources to send daughters away. They could pay maternity home fees, fund temporary relocations, and orchestrate secrecy. They could frame the disappearance as a semester abroad or a stay with relatives. Working-class girls were far more exposed. In Britain, the respectability politics of class operated with particular force. The post-war welfare state expanded social services, but it did not erase stigma. Illegitimacy carried consequences for housing, employment, and social standing. Claire Wills writes about the premium placed on respectability in Irish rural communities. Farm economies were precarious. Reputation was tied to marriage prospects, inheritance, and survival. The cost of scandal was not only emotional, it was economic. County councils funded mother and baby homes in part because they were cheap. Religious orders ran them without salaries. The institutions allowed communities to tidy away the problem of illegitimacy behind closed doors. That phrase, tidy away, is doing a lot of work. For middle-class families, concealment preserved status. For working-class families, institutionalization often meant longer stays, harsher labor, and fewer exit routes. In Ireland, women in mother and baby homes in the 1940s and 50s sometimes stayed more than a year, far longer than comparable institutions elsewhere in Europe. And then there is visibility. If you live in a suburban American neighborhood, disappearance can be staged cleanly. If you live in a tightly packed industrial town or a rural parish where everyone knows everyone, concealment required institutional relocation. Reputation wasn't just social, it was geographic, and geography follows class lines. The good girl ideal assumed certain preconditions. A family invested in upward mobility, a community invested in moral performance, access to concealment, and the presumption of innocence. Without those, the category collapses. This is why the good girl was never simply about behavior, it was about who counted as salvageable. Some girls were framed as tragic mistakes who deserved a second chance. Others were framed as inevitable cautionary tales. When Christine said that adding Mrs. in front of her name meant she was finally treated like a human being, she's not just describing marital status. She's describing entry into legitimacy, into a social category that confers protection. And legitimacy has always been unevenly distributed. The system did not treat all girls the same. It didn't even pretend to. Some were hidden, some were discarded, and some were never allowed to be good at all. And that distinction still echoes. Once you understand the machinery of reputation, you can begin to understand something else. Reporting harm was dangerous. In the post-war decades that we've been examining, sexual assault didn't enter into a neutral system. It entered the same moral economy that punished pregnancy. The first question was rarely, what happened? It was, what did you do? In the United States, before the 1970s reforms to rape law, courtroom standards routinely scrutinized a woman's sexual history. A good reputation could bolster credibility. A bad reputation could destroy it. In practical terms, that meant girls already labeled fast or in trouble were less likely to be believed. The system weighed innocence like evidence. And innocence, as we've just seen, wasn't evenly distributed. Many of the women interviewed by Ann Fessler described pregnancies that resulted from coercion or assault, yet the language surrounding their experiences rarely used the word rape. Instead, what surfaces in testimony is shame, confusion, self-blame. Some had parents who screamed at them when they learned of the pregnancy. Others were sent away immediately. The question of consent dissolved into the urgency of concealment. The machinery moved too quickly for nuance. In Britain and Ireland, the dynamic was similar. Women in mother and baby homes often arrived after relationships in which the father disappeared. Some pregnancies resulted from assault, others from relationships shaped by uneven power and limited sex education. The commission reports acknowledge that women who gave birth outside marriage were subject to particularly harsh treatment. But even in the official language, the emphasis drifts towards family failure rather than institutional design. When a girl reported assault, she risked becoming the scandal. Reporting could mean exposure, interrogation, moral scrutiny. Silence, in contrast, preserved at least the possibility of reintegration. Low reporting rates were not evidence of low incidence, they were evidence of social calculation. One woman Fessler interviewed described how she was treated after relinquishment as though she had done something unspeakable. Now imagine navigating that climate as a survivor of assault. The cost of speaking could include expulsion from school, removal from community, or permanent reclassification as a ruined woman. The system didn't protect girls from harm, it protected itself from scandal. If pregnancy was visible evidence, assault was invisible risk. And in a reputation economy, invisibility was safer. Girls learned quickly. Manage it quietly, don't draw attention, don't make trouble, don't become the story. The logic was brutal, but coherent. If being good was your insurance policy, reporting harm meant surrendering that policy. And so silence became survival strategy. So now it's time to bring this to the modern age. The institutions we've been talking about have largely closed or transformed. The maternity homes are shuttered, the industrial schools were investigated, Title IX changed formal school policy. Adoption practices shifted towards openness, public apologies were issued, redress schemes were launched. But the logic has never disappeared, it just adapted. In the 1950s, a girl vanished and the neighborhood pretended not to notice. Today, the neighborhood has Wi-Fi. Whisper networks used to move through cafeterias and church pews and across backyard fences. Now they move through group chats and screenshots. Parish gossip has been replaced by algorithms that reward outrage. Girls in trouble is no longer a charity euphemism, it's a trending topic. The mechanics are familiar. A photo circulates, a rumor spreads, a private message becomes public. The question is still the same. What did she do? If the baby scoop era was built on concealment, the digital era is built on exposure, but both are powered by reputation as currency. In the past, the strategy was geographic removal. Spend the summer at your aunt's. Today, it is reputational exile. Account deleted, comments locked, school switched, job lost. The form changes. The social death feels eerily consistent. The difference is scale. In the 1960s, a high school scandal might travel across town. In the 2020s, scandal can travel across continents before lunch. And once again, the burden falls unevenly. Research on online harassment shows that girls and young women, particularly women of color, experience disproportionate levels of sexualized abuse and reputational attack. The adultification bias we discussed earlier follows them into digital spaces. The presumption of innocence remains conditional. If you didn't want to be judged, you shouldn't have posted. If you didn't want to be exposed, you shouldn't have sent that photo to your partner. If you didn't want attention, you shouldn't have worn that. If you didn't want commentary, you shouldn't have been there. It's the same grammar we saw in the 1950s. The verbs haven't changed, only the platform has. Even institutional echoes persist. Investigative reporting this year has shown that some religiously affiliated maternity homes and support programs for pregnant teens still operate in ways that critics argue prioritize moral messaging over full-spectrum options. The rhetoric of refuge remains powerful, so does the rhetoric of shame. Reputation is still treated as something girls must manage carefully, defensively, constantly. Visibility is still framed as risk. Silence is still framed as dignity. And when harm happens, the first instinct in many communities remains containment. Don't make it public, don't escalate it, think about your future. The cage has better branding now. It uses the language of empowerment, personal responsibility, even choice. But the underlying structure is recognizable. Safety in exchange for compliance, belonging in exchange for self-policing, protection in exchange for being small. The 20th century hid girls in institutions. The 21st century subjects them to permanent visibility. Different tools, same pressure. There is one question that keeps surfacing in all of this, and it is uncomfortable. If the system was so punishing, why did so many women comply with it? Why did families consent to it? Why did entire communities sustain it for decades? Claire Wills asks a version of this question when she wonders how ordinary people, parents, siblings, lovers, could have allowed daughters to be institutionalized and babies to be adopted away. She calls it a near-far problem. The distance between then and now feels enormous, but the distance between us and the people who believed in that system is small. The answer is not that women were foolish. The answer is that the cage offered something real. It offered belonging. In post-war societies, structured around respectability, marriageability, and moral standing, reputation was currency. Without it, doors closed, employment narrowed, housing options vanished, church membership cooled, marriage prospects evaporated. The cage did not just threaten punishment, it promised integration. Disappear quietly, surrender the baby, return without scandal, and you might still have a future. That was the bargain. For a middle-class white girl in particular, surrender was framed as a temporary stain that could be removed, a mistake that could be corrected, a life that could resume. Some women described going along because the alternative was permanent exile. As one interviewee reflected, she complied so everyone around me would be comfortable. Silence was not always obedience, sometimes it was survival. And families complied because they were calculating risk. In small towns and tight parishes, scandal was not abstract. It could affect siblings' marriage prospects, employment opportunities for your parents, social standing. Respectability was not simply pride. It was about economic security. The system doesn't have to force everyone at gunpoint. It just has to align incentives in a way that makes it impossible to do anything else. If you want your daughter to be safe later, you accept her disappearance now. If you want your son to marry well, you don't challenge the structure. If you want to remain inside the moral community, you perform agreement. The cage worked because it distributed responsibility downward and offered partial protection in exchange for compliance. It told women, cooperate, and you might be forgiven. Refuse, and you definitely won't be. And when the cost of refusal is isolation, poverty, or social death, cooperation just feels rational. That's what makes it a cage instead of a conspiracy. There's not a single villain, no single command, just a network of incentives that makes silence feel safer than rebellion. Even women who hated the system sometimes defended it, because once you have survived by complying, it's terrifying to admit that the compliance was coerced. It's easier to believe you chose it. This arc has been all about cages that didn't look like cages. Chivalry promised protection, but what it secured was control. Domesticity promised purpose, but narrowed your horizons. Marriage framed itself as a choice while quietly arranging the conditions that made choice feel inevitable. And reputation, the most invisible of the pretty cages, presented itself as safety. If you behave, you will belong. If you belong, you will be protected. That was the bargain. The good girl sat at the center of that arrangement, not because she was especially moral, but because she was stabilizing. She reassured families and schools and churches and governments that everything was working as intended. She was proof that the rules were reasonable, that the system was fair, and that order could be maintained without visible force. When she stayed within the lines, nothing had to move. But when she stepped outside them, when she became pregnant, when she reported harm, when she refused silence, the machinery turned. Not always loudly, often very quietly and politely, sometimes with paperwork, sometimes with prayer, sometimes with the softest possible language that it's for the best. To be a good girl was never simply a compliment. She functions as a form of risk management. Her body carries reputational consequences for everyone around her. Her visibility threatened carefully constructed narratives, and so she was taught from an early age to manage herself preemptively, to anticipate judgment, to avoid exposure, to absorb damage quietly if it meant preserving the status quo. That lesson did not vanish when the institutions closed. It migrated, it adapted, it lives in the digital spaces, it's whispered in group chats and advice columns and political debates about morality and family and responsibility. The language shifts, but the underlying logic remains startlingly familiar. If you're harmed, think about your future. If you speak, think about your reputation. If you want safety, stay small. Keep out of the way. And yet, once you recognize the pattern, it becomes a lot harder to accept it as natural. The next time someone uses the description good girl, it's worth pausing long enough to ask what they mean. Do they mean this is a girl who is ethical, kind, responsible? Or do they mean manageable, compliant, and willing to carry the weight of silence for someone else to remain comfortable? Translation is a kind of resistance. When you understand the structure beneath the language, you loosen its hold. Because goodness should not require disappearance. Worth should not depend on innocence, and belonging should not be contingent on remaining silent. In our next episode, we're going to look at a cage that arrives wrapped in affirmation instead of prohibition, one that speaks in the language of energy and empowerment and sacred femininity. It will look softer, it will sound progressive, it will promise connection rather than control, and we will ask the same question we've been asking all along. Who benefits from that script? Thank you for listening. I'm Professor Meredith, and this is Bitchy History.
History. History. History. History.
History.
What a bitch, right?